This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I said recently that I'd do some talking around some of the filmmaking techniques I use, because I know some of you are filmmakers and you're interested in that sort of stuff. So I thought, seeing as I'm stuck in a hotel room tonight here in Lisbon, just after my shoot with Martin Rotz, you might have already seen that video. I've got my flight back to London the next morning. I thought tonight I would just make a quick video talking you through how I shoot the B-roll for the videos that I do. And B-roll, for those of you who don't know, just describes any supplemental footage you capture to make the story more visually rich. A-roll, although that term isn't used as much anymore, would just describe the interview material. So with the previous video with Martin, the A-roll was him talking to camera and telling us things about his photography. And the B-roll was anytime we went out into the streets and I shot him actually in action, so I could cut that footage over the top to make the whole thing, the whole narrative, more visually interesting. And I used to travel with sliders and tripods and drones and gimbals and GoPros and as many things as I could to make that footage move and do things, because I thought the more it moved and the more clever tricks I used, the better the storytelling would be. But I actually ended up finding the opposite in my case. Back in 2014, for example, I went to New York to go and film a little documentary series on a comedy podcast I've listened to for years, Keith and the Girl, and I took so much stuff for that trip. I took, multiple tripods, light stands and lights and sliders and multiple camera bodies and multiple lenses, all in these long roller bags that my clothes just ended up sort of wrapped around light stands, and they were more padding to actually keep things from banging against each other than actual stuff I cared about wearing during the day. In fact, usually when I put it on, it was just creased and matted and everything, but I had all this gear because I knew if I had lots of stuff, it was gonna be a great film. It was on one particularly rainy afternoon. It was like one of those apocalyptic summer storms that fly through New York at that time of year, and I was huddled under an awning outside a shop, a really thin one, and the rain was just hammering down, and I had my roller bag up against the wall, trying to stand in front of it to protect the gear, a heavy backpack on my back, just looking at all this stuff I had and thinking, I haven't even used 60% of this stuff. I could have left most of it at home and pretty much done exactly what I was doing anyway. And even the fancy stuff that I had ended up using, I realized that I could have actually just done it much simpler and got pretty much the same results. And since then, I've just decided to try strip down my gear, especially my filmmaking gear, when I travel as much as possible without compromising the quality. So I think for now I've managed to pare my kit down as much as possible, especially when it comes to shooting B-roll. I'd love to get later into the year into how I shoot and light and interview if you're interested in that sort of thing. And I also want to talk about my style of filmmaking and the people who I respect and gravitate towards, and why I can pare stuff down and keep it simple, because the style of shooting I like actually fits with that more minimalist approach. But for now, I'm just going to share with you my one camera, my one lens, and my one filter that I use for shooting all my B-roll. So the camera that I use is the Sony A7 III, and I'm not telling you to go out and buy this camera. I'm not recommending it to you. You really have to do your homework and work out whether it's the right choice for you. It is for me and my needs. And the first and biggest reason that this is right for me is because of the full frame. I want those better options for depth of field. I want to be able to shallow stuff out, and full frame is really going to help me do that. Plus the fact that it's a full frame sensor means that it's going to be better in low light. So that's why this works. I love the autofocus system on these. I find they're really accurate. I came from Canon and I was always really impressed with the 80D that I used to use and how quickly it would pick up a face, but this takes it to another level. I use the zone setup for the autofocus on this, and it's not zone focusing like you think of street photography. Perhaps we flick it in manual and then you can set to a certain distance. They have something called zone, where basically I can select quadrants here with the hatch switch, and I can flick things between sort of top left, bottom right, center, center middle, center upper, and I can say where I want the autofocus to focus primarily, or or weighted more in a particular zone. So if something happens in the top left of the frame, I can literally just flick it over to the top left and say, this is where I want you to pay attention to that autofocus system. But the face detector is still working all the time. So if something comes into frame that's a face, it will pick that up and put that over the top of anything that you're doing. And I find those intuitive systems really helpful, and I miss way less shots because this is thinking for me. The in-body stabilization is also really important for me on this camera, and that just means that the sensor is moving to compensate for the shake of my hands, giving me a more stable shot. And that means that I actually don't need to take a tripod with me when I'm running around and shooting B-roll. I can just brace my elbows into my body like this and hold it with two hands, and even though my hands might shake a little bit, that in-body stabilization will actually take a lot of that out, and I can fake the look of a tripod just by doing this. If I really want to make sure, I can just lean against the corner of a wall perhaps, and then it's just rock solid. And I can also make movements, pans and tilts, and it'll take out some of that amateurish shake that often comes into it. Because something I've learned is that a pan is great, a tilt is great. What you don't want is this boating, this rocking action. That's what sells it as amateurish movements in your footage. So just doing this, actually I can get some pretty good moves out of it, and the in-body stabilization is taking the shake out of the rest. When it comes to resolution, and this might surprise you, I shoot everything and always have done in 1080p. I have never used 4K. I may do in the future, I'm not ruling it out, but for now, 1080p is plenty for me. And there is a specific reason for that, and this is a personal preference for me. I find 4K footage very sharp, and obviously that's the point, but it's sharp to the point where it starts to feel digital and less filmic. And in my mind, I think most of the cinema I've ever seen projected on a screen probably wasn't even in 1080p, especially with old projectors when I was watching films as a teenager, and I want that softer filmic look. So I shoot everything in 1080p, and I even dial the sharpness back often on that 1080p footage. I'm not recommending that to you. I know that might sound like I'm a dinosaur to you, but that is the look of the footage I want, and it means smaller file sizes, and it makes it really easy to work that way for me. Now for my frame rate on this camera, I shoot all my B-roll at 120 frames a second. And before you go, yeah, it's an overused fad that everyone shoots everything at 120 and uses that slow motion footage all the time. It's not really the reason I do it. My thinking around that is that I might want it to be slower than it actually is. I might want to use it at normal speed. But if I shoot it at 24 frames a second, which is a nice cinematic frame rate, and I want to slow it down, I don't have enough frames to spread out to half the speed or quarter the speed. But if I shoot everything at 120 frames a second, I can play that back in the edit. I can speed it back up to normal speed, or I can take it to half speed, or I can even take it right down to a quarter speed or a fifth speed if I want to. I have the options for all of those because I recorded it with plenty of frames. I use the S and Q on the dial, which on the Sony just stands for slow and quick. So my normal little movie dial here on the top, that's shooting at 24 frames a second and capturing audio. The minute I click to S and Q, it's down to 120 frames a second and no audio, but that's okay because I don't record audio into this camera. I'll talk about that in a second. I know when you flick to S and Q, it's a lower bit rate, but honestly, I can't tell the difference in the footage. Just being able to flick with my finger between 24p, normal frame rate, normal speed, and being able to capture audio if something's happening in the moment and I need it on camera in a pinch because I don't have time to pull out a recorder, or being able to flick to S and Q and having all those 120 frames so I can choose how fast or slow I want to play that back later, knowing I have all those frames at my disposal. Working like this means I have all those options and they're just a click away. But one of the biggest pluses when it comes to filmmaking with the Sonys for me personally is the huge variety of picture profiles you get. And a picture profile just describes the look of the footage that you're collecting in camera, and also how gradable that footage is later when you decide to put color and contrast back into it. And I use picture profiles really specifically, and let me explain. I don't use the same picture profile in all situations because I don't think the same profile serves all lighting conditions equally. And the rough rule I have for myself in my head is that the brighter the light, the more contrasty the lighting outdoors, the flatter the picture profile I will use, and the lower the light situation, the more contrasty picture profile I'll use. I use S-Log extremely rarely in these cameras, and anytime you've got log in your picture profile name, it just describes a really flat contrast picture profile. So it's gonna be very washed out, not much color, and very, very little contrast. The only times I'd ever really use log maybe I'm out in the desert filming someone in dark clothes, and the contrast between those bright highlights and the dark clothes is just too much to hold, then I might flick it into S-Log. Or say I'm shooting in a forest and there's hard sunlight coming through, but a lot of very dappled light, and the contrast between that shadow and the dappled light and the highlights is just too big and too complicated. I might use log in that circumstance, so I've got options in the grade. If you shoot on a Canon, that would be C-Log. If you shoot on a Fuji, that would be F-Log. Those are your logs, so very, very rarely for me. For 90% of my filming during the day, I'm using a tweaked version of Cine 4, and for that tweak, I'm really indebted to Cody Blue, who has a great YouTube channel. I'm going to link the specific video I watched below, and I basically copied those settings in with 1 or 2 minor changes, but he's got a great setup, and that's pretty much the setup I'm copying, and I find that footage really versatile and gradable. The reason I use that Cine 4 is it's a nice middle ground between the very flat C-Log footage and the standard footage you get out of camera. It hasn't got too much contrast, it still holds quite a lot of dynamic range, and it's still got those colors in there. You can see what you're getting. It's not too washed out. And I found that when I was grading log footage, for example, because the bit rate in a lot of these cameras isn't great, and you had to pull that image so far to get your contrast back in, that all that pulling with curves and levels meant that it started to break up. But Cine 4 is that nice middle ground where you're getting half of that contrast in, still holding some of that dynamic range, and just having to take it that 50% at the end, and not having to pull that image too far at the end so it doesn't break up. And I suppose if you are on the Fuji cameras, Cine 4 would equate to something like Eterna, and if you're on the Canons, it might be something like the Marvels or the Cine style picture profiles you can download, although Cine style's a little bit flatter, I think, or maybe something like Philip Bloom's settings for the neutral profile. And the other profile that I use is Cine 2. And Cine 2 I reserve for nighttime shooting or low light. And I learned this the hard way, that if you shoot on a lot of cameras on a very flat picture profile in low light, and then you try and grade that later, what the camera's doing in low light to keep those flat shadows, all that detail, is it's boosting the ISO up. So you get these very noisy shadows. And you might say, well, I like noise, it looks interesting. Personally, I don't mind grain, but I really don't like digital noise in my shadow. It doesn't look good. So to get the cleanest possible image, I choose to use Cine 2, which is slightly more contrasty than Cine 4, and I choose to try and get it as close as possible in camera, so I need to just do minor tweaks in my grade at the end, and that way the image overall, and especially those shadows, look clean. So for me, the way to think about it is the brighter the light, the flatter the picture profile I'm going to use. Extremely bright conditions, I might use a log. In normal conditions, day to day, when I'm shooting outdoors, I will almost always use that middle ground, that Cine 4. But if it's nighttime, I want Cine 2, which is even more contrast, not quite as contrasty as the standard profile, but if you're on a Fuji, that might be a slightly flattened out version of a standard profile, maybe a chrome with a lifted shadows or something. Or if you're on a Canon, it might be a portrait or landscape, just with the contrast dialed down just a little bit. And the one lens that I use is the Tamron 28-75. And this lens has been great for me. And for those of you who have that conspiracy theory that I secretly work for Sony, they wouldn't be happy with me recommending their cameras to you, but not their glass. Honestly, this lens is a third of the price of the Sony G Master, and for me, just as sharp from what I can see, and it's half the weight, and that's the big deal. When I'm traveling and carrying multiple bags with me, I don't want lots of heavy glass, and this lens, as a one setup, run and gun lens that I can zoom everything at 2.8 in a really lightweight package, has been absolutely brilliant. And I know some people, when they got it to start with, said that the autofocus really wasn't keeping up, but I upgraded straight away to the 2.0 firmware on this lens, and I've never had a problem. That 28 to 75mm range is really good for me because I like to shoot in that sort of normal range of the human eye. And honestly, I'm living between 35 and 50 for most shots because that feels most like our eye sees, and that's how I like to shoot. I don't like the huge compression of longer lenses like 100mm and 200mm, and I also don't like the distortion of anything from 24 onwards. So sitting with a lens like this and mostly using that middle sweet spot between 35 and 50 works out perfectly for me, and everything else in getting the good shot comes down to me composing it well by moving around. And the one filter that I use is a Variable ND filter. An ND just stands for Neutral Density Filter. And a good ND filter, what it does is it cuts the light out of your shot without affecting the colors in the image. And when you buy your ND filter, it will often have a number next to it telling you how much it's going to cut that light by. So an ND2 will cut your light in half. and ND4 will cut your light by 1/4, and ND8 will cut your light by 1/8. But a variable ND filter allows you to twist two planes against each other so that it will cut light out gradually just with the one filter, which means you don't have to be changing your filters the whole time. You've got a range of light being cut just with the one filter on, just by twisting. So why would you want to use a variable ND filter? Well, for me, it's to do with keeping my settings, the settings I want in camera, because there are some settings you can't change and that need to stay there, and you need the flexibility to cut the light out. So let me start by sharing my settings. I always want my ISO as low as possible. I don't like digital noise. If you like it, that's great. You can push it into your images on purpose. I can feel the difference between that sharp, pixely digital noise and more organic film grain. I don't like the former, I do like the latter. So I keep my ISO at 100 all day, wherever possible, and as the light starts to drop, I will slowly bring it up, using it as little as I actually have to boost my exposure. If I'm filming correctly, I also don't have the option to change my shutter speed to change the exposure, because the basic rule is if I want movement in my shots to look good and natural, not so jumpy and jerky on the one end or blurry and flowy on the other, but just normal and natural to the human eye, then the basic rule is that my shutter speed needs to be 1/double my frame rate. So if I'm shooting all day at 24 frames a second, which is a nice cinematic frame rate, then my shutter speed needs to be 1/48, in which case in this camera it'd be 1/50, because that's the closest I can get, and that means movement will look good. If I flicked into S&Q and I'm shooting at 120 frames a second, then double that is 240. So I would need to be 1/240th on my shutter speed, closest to that, and this camera will be 1/250. So those shutter speeds are set in camera, and if I want movement to look good, I can't change my shutter speed. So now let's say you're shooting on a bright sunny day. You already have your ISO at 100, and you want to be at f2 because that's going to give you the depth of field you want. But at 100, 1/50 at f2 on a bright sunny day, you are definitely going to be overexposed. So you need that fourth way to cut the light out somehow and keep the settings you want in camera. So that's where the variable ND comes in. It's a mechanical way to cut the light out in my shot and keeping the settings in camera. It means my ISO stays the same, as low as possible. My shutter speed doesn't move, so it doesn't mess with the look of the shot and the movement that's happening in there. And my depth of field, my aperture, stays exactly the same, and I can cut the light out, get consistency in my shots, but change the exposure so I'm dialing it into where it needs to be with those changing light conditions. I used to use Tiffin variable ND filters, which covered a really big range and let you cut a lot of light out, but they had a very specific problem in that if you twisted them almost to the end and you were starting to cut a lot of light out, you get this strange vignetting around the end. It's called cross vignetting, where you have dark corners on the opposite sides of the image, and you often couldn't see that it was happening if you were just working off the screen on the back of the camera, and it just ruined too many shots, and it made me stop wanting to use variable NDs altogether. However, I was recently sent these variable ND filters from PolarPro, and they've done something quite clever. Instead of giving us that 2 to 9 range where you twist too far and get the cross vignetting, they've split their variable NDs into two. They've given us a 2 to 5 and a 6 to 9. So something that will cut your light out by between a half and a fifth, and the other one from a sixth to a ninth, but you know you can twist it all the way and it will never vignette, which is great. I only ever really use the ND 2 to 5 filter. I find it's great for almost all situations. There are times, where I want to go out and shoot something really shallow on a bright day, say at f1.8, and then I would take out the ND 6 to 9 because I need to cut even more light out. But for most B-roll that I shoot, I'm happy to make a little compromise on the actual aperture if I find the sun is just too bright, and just ride that ND filter for the rest. And it's a great way to expose. It feels like a mechanical way to expose, just to be dialing that light in with your fingertips until it is exactly where you want it to be in the shot. Full disclosure here, PolarPro did send me a couple of these for free, but they didn't ask for any advertising, they didn't ask for a video review or me to mention it. In fact, I said I wouldn't, so this will be a surprise to them, and they haven't given me any money. I'm not telling you about this because they gave them to me for free, I'm telling you because I think they're really, really good, and if you are a filmmaker, they might be an option that you're interested in. Now for audio, as I mentioned, I don't capture audio in the camera. I've got some nice Rode video microphones and the rest of it, and the mics themselves are really good. But what you need to understand about these sort of cameras is they're first stills cameras video for a lot of manufacturers was an afterthought. So even if you plug the best mic in on top and jack it in on the side, and the mic is amazing, when that audio gets captured in camera, it's going to get compressed down into a file format that's small and usable enough to go on an SD card, and it's not going to capture the quality that you might want. So I use an external recorder. I use the little Zoom H1, which is a little pocket recorder. It takes two AAA batteries and a little micro SD card in the side. I think I've got an 8 gig in there. And if I put that on WAV, which is the highest audio quality, in the little device, it will record for 8 hours. So I can just walk around into a space while I'm shooting B-roll and go, the sounds here are interesting. There's an interesting soundscape happening. Just sit it on a park bench or on a wall and just let it record for 2 minutes, just capturing sounds in that space so I can build it back into the film later. I also make sure that I save all these in folders on my computer and label everything, because I'm collecting soundscapes from around the world, from different cities or different places I go in nature. And you never know when you might need them. Sometime in the future, you just need that cityscape or just that sound of waves on a beach that will just feed underneath that footage and enrich that whole experience. So I'd advise you to start collecting just audio wherever you go. It doesn't have to be for long, just setting your recorder up for 1 minute during a day when you're traveling. And over time, you'll collect this catalog that will help your filmmaking be a more immersive experience. So I'm just gonna leave you with a selection of some of the B-roll I've captured just with this, just running around, handheld for the last few little documentaries I've made, just so you can see that it doesn't take all those other things. Yes, there's a place for a drone and a place for a slider and a place for a gimbal, and sometimes I do break them out, but I just want to show you how much you can do with just one camera, one lens, and one filter in your hand, taking the time, composing well, and capturing footage that will enrich the story you're trying to tell. Before I show you that though, I just want to say thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and if you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my kind of online home for my photography for at least the last 8 years now. Especially if you're a filmmaker or a photographer like me who doesn't know very much about web design, they have some beautiful, clean and minimalist templates where you can load up galleries of your images or playlists of your videos, or a blog, or even a store where you want to sell your prints or spaces on workshops. I've found it super easy to use, and if anything has gone wrong, they've got award-winning customer service ready to help you. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.